Amen. Okay, so what I'm doing today is continuing where we left off last time I spoke. Last time we did a study which I titled it The Overturning, because we're looking at the time period from the Pannian Way mark to Sunday Law, which is marked by a theme of overturning. So this is overturning part 2. On board here, I've got some of the symbols that we introduced with last time as well, when I named a bunch of different symbols and said what is similar or what connects all of these, what do all these have in common. And they were all symbols of the Sunday Law, symbols that we can take to help us understand the Sunday Law. So that's quite a lot on the list, and I think the real benefit is that we get lots of different perspectives on what the Sunday Law waymark could look like when we look at these histories. So what we're going to do is review some of them. The ones that we did last time out of these were Myra, did that one. We did Shipwreck, there, and we did this one here, Tarentum Falls and Pyrrhus Dies. So we did Acts 27, these two, and one of the Pyrrhus ones. So we'll do the next one today, hopefully. So I'll do a bit of revision on these ones before we get into the next ones. But my plan is to go on and look at more of Pyrrhus and look at World War II, World War I, and Third Daiichi War. We'll see how much content we get through. It's okay if we don't finish, we'll just keep rolling it over to another study if we need to, so we can take our time and not rush and just look at all those details. Just have a look at what we did last time. I left it on the board so we could do some revision and keep adding to it, and then when we've got the screen captures, it'll mean that we can have a snapshot. You can keep that and use it as a reference if you want to. So in Acts 27, the first ship was the ship of Adramyttium. And for Sunday Law, we would line that up with Myra. It's Myra in Lycia. What we learn from that line is that by the time we get to Sunday Law, there's been an overturning of the SDA Church. There's been an overturning of the United States. We bring in the United Nations here. We get a symbol of bitterness at Sunday Law waymark. Wolfish was another symbol, and ripening grain. So why do we get overturning from that line? Does anyone remember what it was that gave us that symbol, that idea of overturning? If not, it's okay. It was the word Cilicia, the name Cilicia, which was in that just leading up to the Sunday Law waymark, they went through or past Cilicia, which means overturning, which, you know, we get the same thing coming up a few times there. So a Cilicia here. We get the United Nations. Does anybody remember why we would bring the United Nations in? What justification we have for that? It's a word that starts with P. It was also another name. It's similar to, related to Cilicia. If you remember, that Cilicia came coupled with another name.
Pamphylia. That's
wonderful. Thank you, Graham. So Pamphylia, and Pamphylia translated to a nation of every tribe. It was similar to the word pan, like, you know, all together. So that's why we bring in the United Nations there, another testimony for that. Bitterness. Does anybody remember why we said bitterness was a symbol here? The name, it's a name that means something like bitterness.
Myra.
Myra. Yep. Myra is similar to myrrh, and the meaning of that word is bitterness. So that's why we mark bitterness here. Wolfish, does anyone remember? I think, James, you were the one who remembered some of these ones in memory.
From the grain, white from Myra.
So this one here, the grain. So that one was, so it's Myra in Lycia. So the names together, Lycia was where we got the grain definition, and wolfish as well, because that word Lycia had two meanings. So yeah, thanks. I'm pretty sure, yeah, you remembered at the time. So it's good. So that's a little bit of revision on why we're putting those symbols in there. I put a reference there, so that's still there if anybody wants to look more in depth, because this is really a quick flyover of the study, just to bring out these features so we can sort of have them all in front of us at once and just do some revision as we're approaching Sunday Law Waymark. All right, moving on to the other ship. So Sunday Law in that line is shipwreck. So Myra, we can bring a certain perspective on what it will look like, and shipwreck is one that really comes to mind quite easily. I think for most of us, we're quite aware that Sunday Law is really a shipwreck waymark. The overturning here really comes from this idea of a shipwreck. So this institution is shipwrecked, and this institution is shipwrecked, and in their place you see another institution rising up. So the Church Triumphant is rising up here. That's us. The Seventh Kingdom is rising up here. So you see it matches up here with that, a different form of this kingdom coming up. The 273 Levites, can somebody remind me, where did we get that from?
That was the number of people in the ship when you took away Paul and the other two. There were basically 3 people you had to take off. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So the ship has got priests and Levites on board, 3 symbolising the priests and the rest symbolising the Levites, which means we get 273 left. And there was another witness for that. It was related to Old Testament passages there, which also is another witness for this number 273 being a symbol for Levites. So yes, we see that they're fully, basically by putting this here, it's saying by the time we get to Sunday Law Waymark, this number is made up, which is what we would expect, which lines up with our understanding of Daniel 2 and the stone, as we're then going to go and do a work in the world. We have public evangelism. So does anybody remember why we put public evangelism here?
When they were shipwrecked on the island, and
Yes.
administering to, yeah. I'm not sure if that's what you were after.
Yeah, I think there's 2, and I think that's one of them. They're shipwrecked on the island. They're going to begin to do the work on the island. So we see that, you know, they're now going to do a work for the world there. There's another one. I'll give people a second if there's someone who remembers it. There was a certain person on the island and their name. It had to do with their name meaning. Speak up with you.
Publius, I think his
Yes.
name was.
Yes, that's right. And the name of that means public, which corresponds very well to public evangelism. So great. So, and counterfeit. Does anybody remember how we get counterfeit there? Simon Magus? No. Simon Magus is back at the earlier Waymark. So on Sunday Law Waymark. We see counterfeit there. Maybe if I say a counterfeit of the Godhead, or I say the group divides into 2, So on board the ship, they were all worshipping as one and
On
eating
the
bread
island,
together.
the island, the worship, there's people that went with Paul and there's others that didn't.
Yes. Who did they pray to? Do you remember? Or does anyone else remember?
Out of the sailors.
Yep, God of the sailors. Any more details anybody wants to add for that? Their names, what they symbolise, the story. Yep, Castor and Pollux. Castor and Pollux, and the story, the backstory for the Castor and Pollux sounded very similar to the story that got read. Yep. All right, good. So that's the justification for putting that in there. So everything's very solid. There's reasons for everything. This might be a name, meaning of a name, or other symbology that's pretty strong. So that's those two lines. Let's move on. If you want to add anything, please interrupt, of course. Pyrrhus in Italy. The symbol there, Sunday law, is 272 BC, which for me doesn't help me remember much, but Pyrrhus dies, or the fall of Tarentum. That's sort of both things happen at that same time. So there's the symbols. That's what Sunday law, what we can learn about Sunday law waymark from this story. We get the end of a war. The war finally ends. So even though at, say, 2021, at that waymark, Pyrrhus loses, it still drags on for a while through that period until Sunday law. And the very end of that war is when Tarentum falls. So same like when we apply it to today, what we're seeing going on, the battle between the King of the North and the King of the South will finally end at Sunday law, even though it's all going downhill now. So that's where we get that. King of the North is rising. We get that from something that's starting to happen towards as we're getting closer to Sunday law. So by the time we get to Sunday law, we see that the King of the North has sort of come up in power. I don't know if that's enough clues. It's tied in with this one, the League. So does anybody remember from that story where we get the League? Okay, let's.
Is it when the Romans come down? First of all, they come down and they make a league with the King of the North. At the sorry, so the question, what was your question? It was like, when does that happen? Or sorry.
The question
what exactly was the question?
You're on the right. Yeah. The question is, I put the word league here, so we've made an application that it's by Sunday law we see a league has formed. And what was it? What happened in the story of Pyrrhus in Italy that gave us that bit of information? And so what you were saying there, the Romans came down and they were making a league with, or they were sending ambassadors. So is that where you were headed, Marie?
Right. So they came down once Pyrrhus was dead, then they came down and made a league with the King of the North. The King of the North? Was it the King of the North? Because they were the King of the North, weren't they?
Yeah,
so
Rome's the King of the North.
Yeah. But they came down and they made a league. I'm sorry, I'm confusing here. I'm sorry, I'll just be quiet.
Oh, no. It's really good because I think what the confusion can be is that how can they come and make a league with the King of the South if the King of the South is dead? So what's happening is that during the time period from, if I use our waymarks, from Panium to Sunday law, in the middle of that period, during that history, they see So the Romans can see Pyrrhus is heading down, like he's going to die. We can see that it's really going to go bad for Pyrrhus. So we can see a new power is probably rising. The Romans are the new power that's rising, sorry. But they're starting to make movements in advance of this final death, because I just said, like, Pyrrhus dies and the war actually ends at the Sunday Law Waymark. So as they're approaching the Sunday Law Waymark, they start to make manoeuvres in the background. So they send ambassadors, but they don't send ambassadors to Pyrrhus because Pyrrhus is going to die. They actually go to Egypt. So what we see during this period is a shifting of who the King of the South is represented as. The King of the South then kind of becomes represented by Egypt. And so they send their ambassadors to Egypt during the end of the war, and then at the very end of the war, when they get to the Sunday Law Waymark, the Egyptians send ambassadors back to Rome. I hope I got that the right way around. Let me just check so I didn't say it the wrong way. So sorry, it's Egypt. I did say it backwards. As during the end of the war, Egypt sends ambassadors to Rome. So they're recognising that there's a new power rising. And then at the end of the war, Rome sends ambassadors back to Egypt, and that basically confirms their arrangement, and that league is kind of really solidified and finalised. Does that make sense to everybody? Because I've kind of muddled that a little. Does anybody have a question about that?
Can I just clarify that, see if I understand it correctly?
Yep.
So you're saying basically that the powers roundabout, Rome, Egypt, could see the fall of Pyrrhus in the foreseeable future. They could see, sort of see that was coming. So they basically wanted to make more alliances to strengthen their position. So Egypt began sending ambassadors to Rome because they could see the King of the North was going to be more of an important power than obviously Pyrrhus, who is now dead, which then automatically switches that Pyrrhus, King of the South, over to Egypt being King of the South. Is that correct?
That's my understanding of it. Yeah. And that was nicely put. Now, the other thing is with the King of the North there, in this story, when we're talking about the battles, for example, Beneventum, which was, the battle there that just came before Sunday Law Waymark. Beneventum, the King of the North, is the United States. We're talking about, war between the United States and Russia. But when we're getting to this league situation, this league is actually between the papacy and the United Nations. So it's not America and the papacy, it's the United Nations and papacy. So I went back and did a little bit of revision to see how come it's not the United States. And the reason is that it's the papacy, not the United States, and because it's not the armies of Rome that are doing this. So if we're seeing the United States as the armies of Rome, this league is not with the army. This league is with, say, the other aspect of the King of the North, if you like. So when we're making application, it's what we're expecting to see now, however that looks, that's a league between the United Nations and the papacy. And that's how it was explained in those presentations done in Arkansas. Any more questions?
Catherine? Yeah, I've got a question, a clarification. I'm just going off my memory. That league in Pyrrhus's time, so when Pyrrhus died, wasn't it a league of, I guess, nations in the local vicinity that took, when I say took, they were basically custodians of Pyrrhus as a country, or that was my understanding from my memory. So it was like a league of, they sort of took over when he died. Wasn't it a league of, I don't want to say nations because it makes me, but it sort of was. But is that right, or am I not remembering correctly?
I don't know. In my mind, that when you get to the sundial waymark, that's where you see the Roman supremacy in the world, in the known world at that time. So you've got Egypt, which represents the world, in a league, or accepting maybe of the Roman power and acknowledging that they're basically the boss. That's how I'm picturing it in my mind. I probably can't clarify you any more than that.
So you're saying that the league is, I guess, Egypt and Rome.
Yes, that's right. It's Egypt and Rome. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't
So
know why I
Egypt.
remember that differently.
Yeah. It's definitely Egyptian ambassadors. They go to Rome first.
Yeah.
And then Rome reciprocates at the sundial waymark and sends ambassadors back. Basically, the deal is done. Pyrrhus is well and truly out of the picture, but at that point, Pyrrhus himself is dead. Tarentum has fallen. There's a new world power on the scene, which we see connects with that theme of overturning. It's complete by that point. Anyone else? That's okay.
Question, please.
Yes.
So we put UN and papacy because we're looking at today's. Okay, I got it. Now, question again that may not be directly related to that. You know how in Daniel 2 we have Babylon. We talk about the king of the north all the time. We don't really talk about the king of the south. In here, it's becoming more vivid where we have in the present history, where we have south and north, and it's always changing depending on like the king of the south changes or king of the north changes. That, am I getting that right? Or is it always going to be the papacy and the United Nations? But in between, does it change?
I'm confused by your question. So what I'm thinking is, Josephine, can you park that question and we come back to it at the very end?
Yeah, well, maybe I'm confused. I've got confused words.
I like to leave some questions till the end sometimes, and that might be a good one because maybe we need to spend a bit of time on that. So if you don't mind, but just make a note and I can get back to it. All right. Anyone else before we go on to some of these other symbols? Okay. So that's the league. All right. What else we had? 46. Anybody remember about why we got 46 out of this story? I can tell you shortly if no one remembers offhand. The symbol of 46 comes up, and we talked about how the meaning of 46 is restoration. Sorry?
Is the temple rebuilding the temple?
Yeah, that's a symbol that we get from a different line. But this line on Pyrrhus, do you know why 46 comes up?
He was 46 when he died.
Yeah, he was 46 when he died. So we can just make note of that because it aligns with our expectation that by this waymark we have the stone fully cut out, the priests and Levites are all there and accounted for. And so we see that number there would align with that. Maximum flood, that was the name of the leading ambassador from Rome, Fabius Maximus Georgius, which the Maximus Georgius part relates, the name meaning is maximum flood. We had harvest as well. We got that if anybody can contribute if they like. There's another name meaning that means Argos. Means Argos. Okay, the answer away. Argos is the one. Okay, so it related to harvest as well. So that's our revision on those. If you need to brush up, then look those presentations up. And let's move on to Pyrrhus and Macedonia and World War II now. I'm going to do these two together. Normally I'm doing them one by one, but these two, they match so well that I want to put them both on the screen together. And there's something special about these two as well. They're a bit different to the ones we've already done. Have a look at that as well. Does anybody remember why, what we must keep in mind when we look at piracy in Macedonia and World War II? There's something very important we need to remember. Just for a little illustration. So I hope you can see it. You should be able to see this part. We have, how many stories have we got on Pyrrhus? I've done Italy and now we're going to do Macedonia, so there's 2. Crooked line, sorry. So this here comes first is actually Pyrrhus in Macedonia, and the one we just already did, just the review just now, is Pyrrhus in Italy. Put I for Italy there. And then we've got, because basically this is almost one thing with the Cold War in the middle. And then we've got World Wars. And I'm going to line it up this way. This is World War II. And this is World War III. We'll look at World War I later. And in between these we get, I think it was marked as a Cold War as well. Yeah. All right. So what do we know when we look at this structure? What does it remind you of? Does it remind you, or, you know, maybe what symbol would I put above each
Alpha
one?
and Omega.
It does, doesn't it? So when we're looking at alpha and omega histories, what do we usually need to remember when we're looking at an alpha history? Something important for us to always keep in mind.
Success and failure.
It's a lot. Yes, failure.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to have, we know it's success at the end, don't we? Because it has to bring about the crisis and succeed. And we know that this one is going to be failure. If it wasn't failure, I guess the second advent would have happened by now or whatever, you know, in the other lines anyway. So we're applying the same principles here. So I'll share screen and we'll just read the quote about that. If someone can volunteer to read, please. This is what Elder Tess said in the presentation at the time.
What we need to do before we continue is to note a problem that you've probably already seen. Am I reading it right? Is that what you want?
Yes, please. Just go ahead and read it through. I've just put it in dot points because she's just going through pointing at the board actually at the time.
First line, Pyrrhus versus Demetrius. Second line, Pyrrhus versus Rome. Third line, Russia versus Germany. Fourth line, Russia versus USA. What we have is an alpha and omega of Pyrrhus' life, and what we have is an alpha and omega of the King of the South. But what we need to note before we make application is that between the alpha history and an omega history, there are some changes, some differences.
Thank you so much for reading. All right, so that was noted, and we can see that hopefully. It's like we said, it's similar to ancient Israel and modern Israel. We had success and failure. There's another quote which I will read out. There's another difference as well in these. So yeah, partly because it's a failure. This is what, let me just read it. For example, here in the Alpha history, so we'll look at Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus loses all but Epirus, so we'll talk about that shortly. So he loses all but Epirus, but so is he losing his own kingdom here? No, he's not. But here in the Omega history, what does Pyrrhus lose? Everything. It's a complete victory for the King of the North. In everything, okay, 1989 in the Alpha history, does Russia lose everything? No. But in our history at the Sunday Law, loses everything. What we noticed between the Alpha history and an Omega history is we need to change the victor and also the antagonist. So we see differences there, two different differences. One is that here there's an incomplete or a partial victory, and here it's a complete victory, or there's a complete outcome. And so that's one difference, whether or not it's complete or partial. And the other difference is who is the antagonist and who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, whatever. We swap the roles around, King of the North and the King of the South. This is something that's unique to both of these lines. So we need to remember that if we're making application of these, we're going to have to switch who's who. It can become a little bit confusing, I think, sometimes. So what we're going to do is revise the history, and then we're going to, when we write it on our sort of summary, I'll try to make that clear as well. When we're making application, that we'll actually be switching them around. Okay, so this is a line of failure, so we need to swap. I'm going to just write a note here. So that's just a note to remind us if we've got a picture of the board. Let's have a look at the first waymark, which is for, sorry, excuse me, for the line of Pyrrhus, we're going to put 287 BC. How are we going to do this here? Let me just see. I think I'm not sharing any quotes. I think I'm just summarising, yeah. All right, so in this waymark here in 287 BC, Pyrrhus, who's the King of the South, Pyrrhus, he joins the allies. So there's allies. There's 3 allies. Joins the allies. So that's the King of the South joins the allies. Demetrius is defeated. So I'll put King of the South here, and here King of the North, Demetrius is defeated. And out of that, the land of Macedonia, if you remember, was divided. So there was an east and west division. All right, so that's that story. I might do the number actually in purple so it doesn't get muddled up here. So this is 1945. And we see a very similar story here. We have King of the South, USSR, with the Allies. And we see King of the North is Germany. It's defeated. And at the end of World War II, we see an East-West division. All right, so very, very closely matching stories there. Okay, in the intervening period, I might do purple actually again. And what we've got here is a Cold War. And here we have a Cold War through that time period. So right now in our dispensation, we're in a kind of a Cold War at the moment. We see battles over spheres of influence and that kind of thing happening today. So that aligns with that. Similar to both of these, we get, because Germany was defeated, the King of the North then changes from Germany to the United States. And in this one, Demetrius was defeated and the new King of the North actually becomes Lysimachus. So in both stories, you see a new King of the North as well. So this is a line of failure. We won't apply that directly, I don't think, in our history, but it just shows that these two are very similar to each other. And in this one, we see sanctions and subterfuge. Going on in the background during this period. And during this period here from 1945, it's going to take us to 1989. We also see sanctions and the solidarity movement. So similar kind of Cold War type activities going on. When we get to this word mark, so this is now 285. And here we've got 1989, which is why 1989 can be a symbol of Sunday book, even though we usually think of it as the beginning of our line. Okay, so here we've got the end of this Cold War period. We have, it's a period of failure, so it's not a complete loss for Pyrrhus. So King of the South, let's say loses, but all that Epirus, I'll just put the E there, loses everything but except for Epirus, gets to hang on to that little bit of territory. So that's a partial victory for the King of the North. And we also have because it's a failure, we now have a change of scene. And the story goes from Macedonia to Italy. And so moving on here now, we're going to be looking at a new territory. So we expect to see, if it all lines up, similar things here. The King of the South loses all. So the King of the South there is the USSR. It loses, except not Russia. Okay. King of the North, that becomes a partial victory. And it's a failure as well, again. And so there's a change of scene. So here they're fighting over Europe, here it's now going global. So it's a change of scene there. So you can see those two line up together really well. Is there any questions on that? I'll put up on the board the application part shortly. Like I said, it's just a very quick overview. You can spend, hours on each story, as each of us know. So let's pop up our summary. I'll put failure here. Just to remind us that we're switching. So in Pyrrhus, Macedonia, Sunday law is symbolised by I'm just writing down the years. So 285 BC. And what we see there in 285, it's a partial victory for the King of the North. Or you could say a partial loss for the King of the South. And you're going to get Sunday, the real Sunday law waymark when we make application. It's a full victory for the King of the North. So that's how we're applying that. All right, but study there, both of these actually from the same Arkansas. It's covered over several there, studies 3 to 5. World War II, it's symbolised by 1989. And what it teaches us in 1989, it was partial victory in the North, but something, same thing, full. Okay, let's move on. Next one I want to review is the Third Diadochi War. So let's have a quick look at that one. I'm not doing this one as a line of failure. This is, we're just looking at this as it is. I'm not swapping anything. So I'll write up what the symbols are and then we'll talk about it. This one here is the Peace of the Dynasts. And that becomes a supremacy of the Seleucid dynasty. And here we've got the Babylonian War. So we're in Cold War on some of the lines, and in this one, with this perspective, we're in a Babylonian War. So we'll look a little bit about what was the Babylonian War all about. Going back to this waymark, just reminding us as well, we were reminded this morning that this lined up with the Battle of Beneventum, and we marked that as an American-led information war because it was elephants, and it was a success for the King of the North as well, if we remember. So what we're going to be looking at now is its information war as well. Still, we know that it's information war today. But in this situation, the King of the South is going to be Ptolemy of Egypt. So just so you can keep that in mind, that it's Ptolemy we're talking about as the King of the South. I'll share a quote if someone can read it. This is from the New York Times. It's just reminding us of how it, about that American-led information war.
Okay, I'll read that for you if you like.
Appreciate that.
Accurate US intelligence did not stop Putin, but it gave Biden big advantages. The depth and the quality of the intelligence strengthened the president's hand in persuading allies to form a unified front against Moscow. Washington. The United States intelligence agencies unearthed Russia's war plans. They accurately assessed President Vladimir V. Putin's intentions, and through strategic public releases of information, complicated his efforts to create a pretext to send his armed forces into Ukraine. They got the timing of his invasion right almost to the hour. The success of American intelligence in reading Mr. Putin is stripping away any element of surprise is one of the most striking developments of the crisis and has had substantial implications as the conflict has exploded into bloodshed. It was not enough in the end to deter Mr. Putin from carrying out the broad assault that got underway early on Thursday. But the depth and the quality of the American intelligence strengthened President Biden's hand in bringing the transatlantic alliance into a unified front against Moscow. It provided time to prepare waves of sanctions and other steps to impose a cost on Russia, dispatch troops to bolster NATO allies, and move Americans out of harm's way. And after high-profile intelligence failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other global crises over the past several decades, the accuracy of the intelligence gave the CIA and the broader array of the US intelligence agencies a new credibility at home and abroad. The result has been a remarkable 4 months of diplomacy, deterrence, and American-led information warfare, including the last-ditch effort to disrupt Mr. Putin's strategy by exposing it publicly. Unlike the withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, it was executed almost flawlessly. Even the Germans and other European nations highly dependent on Russia's supplied gas signed into the playbook.
Thanks, Greg. So I just wanted to bring that back into our mind just so that we can have it in the forefront of our mind as we read now some of this history from this story of the Babylonian War. So hold those ideas in your mind. We've actually lived through the fulfillment of this waymark here, these expectations that we had about what 2021 would be. And now we're going to look at what was said in the study about this waymark as well. So if somebody else can read what happens here in this waymark of the one that lines up with 2021, and we'll look at some of the applications of that too.
I can read it if you like.
That'd be great, thanks.
Antigonus comes back to the war and takes back all that he had lost from Ptolemy to the borders of Egypt. He's about to invade Egypt when he's distracted. There's 2 distractions at that point in time. One of them was the Nabateans. These are tribes from the east that started to harass Antigonus's army. The Nabateans are the descendants of Ishmael. So there's 2 things disturbing Antigonus and stopping him going past the border. The first is the Nabateans. The second is the actions of Seleucus. The Nabateans are the descendants of Ishmael. It's repeating itself there, but anyway, there you go.
Okay, thank you. So what do we see happening here? So this gives us a little bit of insight into what might be happening behind the scenes at this waymark. So we saw this battle happen, so this American-led information warfare, and the prediction was that at this waymark there would be a battle between Antigonus, which we take as a symbol of the King of the North, and attacking Egypt, which is the King of the South. So the King of the North coming towards the King of the South and taking back everything that had been lost. So that would then remind you of the Raphia waymark, where the King of the North had lost some ground. So now we see the King of the North now has won back everything that was lost before, but it doesn't completely eliminate Egypt. It goes to the border. So when we're thinking about this information-led American warfare, they did really well. They were successful. It was executed almost flawlessly, but they didn't kill the King of the South. They went to the border. And there were two reasons why. Who remembers the two reasons? It was just in that quote.
I think it was the distraction of the Babylonian kingdom, and also the Islam. Nicotines, was it Nicotines?
Yep. Nabateans.
Nabateans. Yeah.
Nabateans is Islamic. And Seleucus. Yeah. Seleucus, which we take as papacy. So yeah, we saw this play out. We've seen 2021 play out, but what we probably didn't see is the United States being distracted by the papacy and Islamic activity as well. Or maybe we did see it because we do know that something pretty major happened in 2021 with Islamic nation. Who remembers what happened in 2021? Yep.
The Taliban took Afghanistan.
So, yep, Ray just said the Taliban took Afghanistan. So when we look as well, we're going to look at the Babylonian War and what's happening there when we consider the papacy a bit more. But prophetically speaking, the United States didn't finish the job, so to speak, and kill the King of the South because of these just two distractions that came up. One, I think, is more obvious, Islamic one. Second one, maybe a little bit harder for us to see in the news. So let's read another quote. I can have another reader, or someone can read again.
I can read, Katherine.
Thank you.
Seleucus was on Ptolemy's side at the Battle of Gaza in 2019, we marked it.
Oh, I've put that there, just meaning Battle of Gaza, we marked it 2019.
Yep. After the battle is won, Seleucus sees his opportunity and he takes an army and goes and takes back Babylon. He takes back his throne. Because of these two threats, Antigonus goes to the allies, neither side has won, and they sign what is known as a Peace of the Dynasts. It's a peace treaty, and this is the peace treaty that postponed the war until the Fourth Diadochi War started in 307. This is a break in the middle between the third and the fourth. It enabled Antigonus to deal with his two threats, primarily Seleucus. After the Peace of the Dynasts, the end of the Third Diadochi War, begins the Babylonian War. It's a struggle for power between Antigonus and Seleucus. Seleucus wins, and it marks the beginning of the Seleucid dynasty. In 309 BC, it becomes established.
Okay, thanks for reading that. So 309 BC is I'll just put it up here. That's up on this one now. I'm going to leave the quote on the board, on the screen though, so you can see it when I ask you questions. So, okay, so what the quote there is saying, and this is Elder Tess explaining at the time in that study in 2019, this is from Germany, camp meeting, that there was a battle that kind of wound up when we got to the Peace of the Dynasts, and then in between we see a gap between those two periods of time, and that's where we mark the Babylonian War. So who is struggling during the Babylonian War? Is it the King of the North versus the King of the South, or someone else?
indigenous against Seleucus.
Yeah, it's Antigonus versus Seleucus. So who's going to actually win?
Seleucus.
Seleucus wins. Okay, so this brings a bit of a different perspective on what we're living through at the moment. A little bit of looking at what's happening actually with a competition between the United States and the papacy. So I'll pop it up. Okay, this is a war between Antigonus. Okay, so we're living through this right now. This is going on right now, prophetically speaking. And it's going to end with the supremacy of Seleucus. So the way it looks when it's fulfilled, you know, things can look you know, different to maybe how like a literal reading would maybe lead us to believe. But this is what we're seeing is actually Seleucus coming out on top, or the papacy coming out on top here. Let's read another quote. Quote 5 is a bit of a long one, but if I can have a brave volunteer to read this as well for us, great.
I can read, Catherine.
Oh, thank you.
We have to consider?
Yes, and do you mind reading the whole lot?
Yep, that's fine.
Thank you.
We have to consider the role that the Vatican has played in the last 30 years. Throughout this history, the papacy has not been America's friend or ally because America was acting unilaterally. We come to our history, we have Pope Francis. He's not a friend of Donald Trump. In 2016, he's not kind to Donald Trump, and he was the first Pope at Concord to meet the Russian patriarch in about 400 years. And he's developed a close relationship with Vladimir Putin. Just recently, Pope Francis made a statement and called for a united Europe. He said this is in just the last couple of weeks, he says. I am concerned because we hear speeches that resemble those of Hitler in 1934. Us first, we, these are frightening thoughts. What did he just do? The Pope stole our message. We're the ones saying that we're at 1934 Germany, the rising up of Hitler, Donald Trump. We're hearing Hitler's speeches at Trump's campaign rallies. We're seeing the rising of nationalism. Pope Francis has said immigrants need to be integrated into society. Nationalism is an attitude of isolation. There is a dangerous rising tide of popularism. In 2017, someone asked Pope Francis about popularism. He pointed them back to World War II. He said before World War II, there were people immersed in a crisis. These people were searching for an identity until a charismatic leader came and promised to give them their identity back. And he gave them a distorted identity, and we all know what happened. What is Pope Francis doing? He's sharing our message. It's our message that says there's a rising tide of popularism. People were looking for an identity. They found a charismatic leader who gave them all their promises, gave them a distorted identity. Those speeches resemble those of Hitler that brought them to World War II. When we talk about the counterfeit, it might be closer than we thought. We're warning the world that Trump is Hitler. Pope Francis has been giving the same message, but he's not the true, he's the counterfeit. That counterfeit runs closer to the, I've missed a word there, path of truth than we realise.
Thanks, Marilyn. Thank you for reading that. Okay, so this is what we see happening here. A counterfeit is actually rising up in power, and the counterfeit that looks a lot like us, very similar to us, which is sort of scarier than just pointing out all the problems with the right wing that are, you know, on Donald Trump's side, and all of that is like an easy target for us. But this counterfeit message, which is not radical feminism, is, I guess, in this sense, it's a counterfeit of us that is on the rise, which is not good. So we're just bringing that point into this narrative here to explain what we're looking at the Sunday law is actually, a success for the papacy, and in fact, in this literal history, that Seleucid dynasty becomes the dominant power. Basically, it went from, well, we'll get onto Alexander's kingdom in a second, because I was going to read you this little quote about what happens to Alexander's dynasty. So it basically went from, you know, we had Alexander the Great, then it went to the Diadochi, and then it went to, you know, basically 4 powers, and then we go down to 1. And this is when we're going down to the 1 here. And we see the end, here we mark the end of the dynasty. And that's Alexander's dynasty, and I'll read you that in a second, and the beginning of a new one. Okay. In between those two, here and here, you have multiple powers. But from here, you go from 1 to 1 again, and that overturning is complete, if that makes sense. So we see an overturning is complete there in that history. Here's the quote about what happened to Alexander's dynasty. When they decided on this piece of the Donas here, Cassander had been given the position of protecting Alexander's family. He sees that the threat is real, so he has Alexander's son and his son's mother, Roxanne, killed. And here at the piece of the Donas, you would mark the end of the Gaiad dynasty, the dynasty of Alexander the Great. Now there's no hope of a successor for Alexander. So I've marked that with the wrong spot, actually, because the end of the dynasty is here. Here's where it ends, where there's that death of Alexander's heir, end of dynasty. So that's the end of it. Here it's in transition, and then here you get the beginning of the new dynasty, Seleucus. Okay, so a changing over happening during this period. Right now, we're in this period where just things are, the world powers and things are just sort of overturning. So, any questions on that? I'll write up a summary. I've got to swap the side of the board now. Run out. So this is Third Diadochi War. And Sunday law is marked by the beginning of the Seleucid dynasty. Okay. It's the end, Sunday law is the end of that competition between USA and I think the USA as we knew it, you know, Alexander's empire. It's end of the competition. Hopefully that makes sense to people. Competition between the USA and we'll put Pope Francis. And we're seeing the rise of papacy. Which is a close counterfeit. If you want more information on that, go to Germany, 2019, and it's September. And to look at studies 3 to 5. All right. I've got a little bit more time, so maybe we'll look a little bit at World War I now. Okay, World War I. This one here is Armistice Day. And here we've got the Treaty of Versailles. And actually here, this is what you think basically is the end of World War I, but it kind of doesn't officially end until we get to here, which is where we see it finally ends fully, which aligns with our understanding of what's happening with the King of the South at the moment, this sort of deadly wound and death, if you like. And we see a similar thing with these two waymarks here. The war is basically over, but here it's really over officially. So now, again, this is going to be a history of failure. So we're going to swap. So you can have, even in our lines, we've got failure, failure, success. And you can have World War I, World War II, and then World War III is success. So World War I and World War II both are failures. So if you're ever looking at them, don't forget to swap the King of the North and the King of the South around when you're making application. Here's another quote basically about the same thing. In a history of failure, once you get to battles, so once these wars actually begin on those lines, you switch it, because at some point you know that in a history of failure, the King of the North has to begin to lose. So once you get into battles, you need to switch the victor. So that's why it's with the battles we start switching who's going to win, who's going to lose. All right, let's look at a quote about Armistice Day to Treaty of Versailles. Another volunteer, please. If you've read before, that's fine. You can read again.
Do you want me to read it? Starting where?
Yes, please. Start with quote 6, please. Just everything under that purple heading.
Okay. Leading up to these waymarks, Germany had its own problems. They're still having trouble on the Western Front. Regardless of the condition of the East, the Western Front, they aren't able to win. They're slowly worn down, and on November 11, 1918, Armistice Day, Germany surrenders. As soon as they surrendered, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk 2019 is cancelled or annulled. Anything that they won in this Treaty of Brest, oh, sorry, everyone, they're not lost. World War I was finally over. Germany formally surrendered on November 11, 1918. All nations agreed to stop fighting while the terms of the peace were negotiated. I want us to note, this is not the end of the war. All they've done is lay down their weapons and agree to stop fighting. The war is not formally ended until 1919, and the Treaty of Versailles. This is when Germany finally realized to what extent they had lost that war. We call this the deadly wound, Panium, and the death Sunday law. The war does not end at Panium. Then they have to realize just how badly they've lost. They realize that at the Treaty of Versailles.
Thank you so much. Okay, so hopefully that's not confusing, just picking a little piece of history out of a longer story and sort of trying to jump into another story from story to story. But here we are in World War I. Okay, Germany's been having problems, and anything that they had gained at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which we would have lined up with Raffia, it's all cancelled or annulled by the time they get to the Armistice Day, which we line up with 2021. So it's similar to the other lines where we see everything that was won or lost at Raffia is then taken back at Panium. And again, we see that here. And the war being over, like I already explained, and then finally ending once you get to the Sunday Law. That's when it really completely ends. So I just marked some of that up on the board. So the Armistice Day, we have the King of the North, which is Germany, surrenders. We have basically all the gains are undone. So if we're going to make application, we're looking at Russia. All that they had gained back in 2019 has been undone in terms of spheres of influence and, you know, public support across the world, that kind of thing. This is sort of considered to be a deadly wound. In this case, it's a deadly wound for the King of the North, but we're going to switch who's who. And then by the time you get to the Treaty of Versailles, this is when the King of the North, Germany, actually realises all they've lost. So that's yet to come for Russia, and that's their death, which we mark. It lines up with the death of that power. All right. Another comment that's interesting here is about it's a dissolution of a two-horned power. Which was, what was it, Austrian, Hungarian. So we're seeing basically the breaking of the two-horned power, a marking of the decline of the republicanism in the United States as part of that as well, can be marked there because King of the North is a two-horned power in both cases. All right, so I'll just summarise that. It's World War I. So, and the King of the South. find more information on that, I think for both. You can also go to Australia, and it's 16th of the 11th, 2019, and this studies 1 and 2. Okay, we'll look at that in more detail or revise it further. All right, so there's a lot of history we've looked at today in the 2 studies. So we'll quickly just review what we've done, and then we'll close up and have questions. So swap it back around. Okay, covered a few. We're seeing features. By the time we get to Sunday Law Waymark, we're seeing repeated themes. In purple, I've done ones that have to do with the church, SDA Church and the Church Triumphant, the Levites and priests. We're seeing that theme popping up in several of these. Some of these are more about the countries, the world powers. We've got overturnings popping up several places. We've got the United Nations coming up on several lines as well. We've got it here, maximum flood here. We have on the other board that bit about Seleucus as well. We're seeing that at the Sunday Law Waymark. We're seeing harvest popping up on several of the lines as well. So we know that it's time for public evangelism from Sunday Law onwards. There's testimonies for that. We're seeing this overturning between the King of the South and the King of the North as well. And that, that competition for supremacy is dealt with, and then you get like a world power coming up. And yeah, we revised how we need to switch some of the King of the North and the King of the South sometimes as well. We got, yeah, I think I've there. So yeah, and basically an undoing of everything that had happened at Raphia we see being undone by Panium as well. So that's already happened, but they just don't realise it yet fully, and it'll be at Sunday Law Waymark when they actually realise everything they lost. So that's a bit of a summary of where we've been, and yeah, it's amazing how many different things we can bring to that Waymark of Sunday Law in order to understand a lot of the complexities of what our world looks like and how we can understand and interpret what we're seeing. All right, so let's close in prayer and then I'll open up for questions. Dear God in heaven, great author of history and inspiration that we can study and learn. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface of so many things, and each point has been so laboured and so studied and so investigated, and there are many points that I've not covered, and there is just such a wealth of information there. But yeah, even as we just look at the brief summary, we can see how there are so many testimonies for what we understand and hold to. And as we see things playing out in the world, we are so much better off with having the right perspective on how to understand it. So as we approach the Sunday Law, I pray that you would help us to have eyesight, help us to have vision, not just of world events and world powers, but of sin and what sin is and the sin that we have to deal with. Help us to understand righteousness and help us to understand your character as well. We really need to see clearly, even though we don't like what we see often, but we need that to be safe. So I pray that you would grant us that. Please continue to bless us as we continue to study and learn together. In Jesus' name, amen.